Chapter 3 of the Legion of Lazarus by Edmond Hamilton. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 3. All space was before him, hung with the many-colored lights of the stars, intensely brilliant in the black nothing. It was incredibly splendid, but it was too much like what he had looked at with his cold, unseeing eyes for 50 years. He looked down being relative to where he was standing in the blister window, and saw the whole belt swarming by under him like a drift of fireflies. He quivered inwardly with a chill vertigo and turned away. Vernon was talking aloud. He had been talking for some time. He was stretched out on a soft, deep lounge, smoking, pretending to sip from a tall glass. "So you see, Mr. Hurst, we can help you a lot. It's not easy for a Lazarite, for one of us, to get a job. I know. People have a feeling. Now, Mr. Belliver." "Where is Shearing?" asked Hurst. He came and stood in the center of the room, with the soft lights in his eyes and the soft carpets under his feet. His mind reached out, uneasy and restless, but it seemed to be surrounded by a zone of fog that tangled and confused and deflected it. He could not find Shearing. "We've been here for hours," he said. "Where is he?" "Probably talking a deal with Mr. Belliver. I wouldn't worry. As I was saying, Belliver Incorporated is interested in men like you. We're the largest builders of spacecraft in the system, and we can afford—" "I know all about it," said Hurst impatiently. "Old Quentin Belliver was busy swallowing up his rivals when I went through the door." "Then," said Vernon imperturbably, "you should realize how much we can do for you. Electronics is a vital branch." Hurst moved erratically around the room, looking at things and not really seeing them, hearing Vernon's voice but not understanding what it said. He was growing more and more uneasy. It was as though someone was calling to him, urgently, but just out of earshot. He kept straining, with his ears and his mind, and Vernon's voice babbled on, and the barrier was like a wall around his thoughts. They had been aboard this ship for a long time now, and he had not seen Shearing since they came through the hatch. It was not really a ship, of course. It had no power of its own, depending on powerful tugs to tow it. It was Walter Belliver's floating pleasure palace, and the damnedest thing Hurst had ever seen. Vernon said it could, and often did, accommodate 300 or 400 guests in the utmost luxury. There was nobody aboard it now but Belliver, Vernon, Hurst, and Shearing, the 3 very accurate men, and perhaps a dozen others, including stewards and the crews of the tugs and Belliver's yacht. It was named the Happy Dream, and it was presently drifting in an excessively lonely orbit high above the ecliptic, between nothing and nowhere. Vernon had been with him almost constantly. He was getting tired of Vernon. Vernon talked too much. "Listen," he said, "you can stop selling Belliver. I'm not looking for a job. Where's Shearing?" "Oh, forget Shearing," said Vernon, impatient in his turn. "You never heard of him until a few days ago." "He helped me." "For reasons of his own." "What's your reason, and Belliver's?" "Mr. Belliver is interested in all social problems. And I'm a Lazarite myself, so naturally I have a sympathy for others like me." Vernon sat up, putting his glass aside on a low table. He had drunk hardly any of the contents. "Shearing," he said, "is a member of a gang who some time ago stole a particular property of Belliver Incorporated. You are not involved in the quarrel, Mr. Hurst. I'd advise you as a friend to stay not involved." Hurst's mind and his ears were stretched and quivering, straining to hear a cry for help just a little too far away. "What kind of property?" asked Hurst. Vernon shrugged. The Bellivers have never said what kind, for fairly obvious reasons. Something to do with ships? I suppose so. It isn't important to me, nor to you, Mr. Hurst. Will you pour me a drink? Said Hurst, pointing to the cellaret close beside Vernon. Yes, that's fine. How long ago? What? Asked Vernon, measuring whiskey into a glass. The theft, said Hurst, and threw his mind suddenly against the barrier. For one fleeting second he forced a crack in it. Something over 50, said Vernon, and let the glass fall. He spun around from the cellaret and was halfway to his feet when Hurst hit him. He hit him 3 or 4 times before he would stay down, and 3 or 4 more before he would lie quiet. Hurst straightened up, breathing hard. His lip was bleeding, and he wiped it with the back of his hand. That was a little too big a job for you, Mr. Vernon, he said viciously, trying to keep my mind blanked and under control for hours. He stuffed a handkerchief into Vernon's mouth and tied him up with his own cummerbund and shoved him out of sight behind an enormous bed. Then he opened the door carefully and went out. There was nobody in the corridor. This was wide and ornate, with doors opening off it, and nothing to show what was behind them or which way to go. Hurst stood still a minute, getting control of himself. The barrier no longer obscured his mind. He let it rove, finding that every time he did that it was easier and the images clearer. He heard Shearing again, as he had heard him in that 1 second when Vernon's guard had faltered. His face became set and ugly. He began to move toward the stern of the Happy Dream. Heavy metal cloth curtains closed this end of the corridor. Beyond them was a ballroom, in which only one dim light now burned, a vastness of black polished floors and crystal windows looking upon space. Hurst's footsteps were hushed and swallowed up in whispering echoes. He made his way across to another set of curtains, edged between them with infinite caution, and found himself in the upper aisle of an amphitheater. It was pitch dark where he was, and he stood perfectly still, exploring with his mind. He could not see any guards. The rows of empty seats were arranged in circles around a central pit, large enough for any entertainment Mr. Belliver might decide to give. The pit was brilliantly lighted, and from somewhere lower down came the intermittent sound of voices. Also from the pit came Shearing's cries. Hurst began to tremble with outrage and anger, and his still uncertain mental control faltered dangerously. Then, from out of nowhere, a voice spoke in his mind, and he saw the face of the woman he had seen twice before, the woman Shearing served. "Careful," she said. "There is a Lazarite with Belliver. His attention is all on Shearing, but you must keep your mind shielded. I'll help you." Hurst whispered, "Thanks." He felt calm now, alert and capable. He crept along the dark aisle toward the pit. Mr. Belliver's theater lacked nothing. The large circular stage area was fitted with upper and lower electromagnets for the use of acrobats and dancers with null-grav specialties. They could perform without disturbing the regular grav field of the Happy Dream, thus keeping the guests comfortable, and by skillful manipulation of the magnetic fields, more spectacular stunts were possible than in ordinary no-gravity. Shearing was in the pit, between the upper and lower magnets. He wore an acrobat's metal attraction harness, strapped on over his clothes. When Hurst looked over the rail, he was hanging at the central point of weightlessness, where everything in a man floats free, and his senses are lost in a dreadful vertigo, unless he has been conditioned over a long period of time to get used to it. Shearing had not been conditioned. "Careful," said the woman's warning voice in his mind. "His life depends on you. No, don't try to make contact with him. The Lazarite would sense you." Shearing began a slow ascension toward the upper magnet as the current was increased from some unseen control board. He moved convulsively, turning horizontally around the axis of his own middle, like a toy spun on a string. His back was uppermost, and Hurst could not see his face. "Belliver and the Lazarite," said the woman quietly, "are trying to learn from Shearing where our ship is. He has been able so far to keep his mind shielded. He is a very brave man, but you'll have to hurry. He's near the breaking point." Shearing was now almost level with Hurst, suspended over that open pit, looking down a long way. "You'll have to be quick, Hurst. Please, please get him out of there before we have to kill him." The current in the magnet was cut, and Shearing fell with a long, neighing scream. Hurst looked down. The repelling force of the lower magnet cushioned the fall, and the upper magnet took hold hard. Shearing stopped about 3 feet above the stage floor, and started slowly to rise again. He seemed to be crying. Hurst turned and ran back to the top of the aisle. Halfway around the circle he found steps and went tearing down them. On the next level, there were 3. He saw 2 men leaning over the broad rail, watching Shearing. "Yes, there they are. You must find a weapon." Hurst looked around, blinking like a mole in the dark. Seats, nothing but seats. Ornamentation, but all solid. Small metal cylinder set in a wall niche. Chemical extinguisher, yes. Compact and heavy. He took it. "Hurry, he's almost through." The 2 men were tense and hungry, eager as wolves. One was the Lazarite, a gray man, old and seamed with living, and none of it good. The other was Belliver, and he was young. He was tall and fresh-faced, impeccably shaven, impeccably dressed, the keen, clean, public-spirited executive. "I can give you more if you want it, Shearing," Belliver said, his fingers ready on a control plate set into the broad rail. "How about it?" "Shut up, Belliver," whispered the Lazarite aloud. "I've almost got it. Almost." His face was agonized with concentration. "Now!" The woman's voiceless cry in his mind sent Hurst forward. His hand swung up and then down in a crashing arc, elongated by the heavy cylinder. The Lazarite fell without a sound. He fell across Belliver, pushing him back from the control plate, and lay over his feet, bleeding gently into the thick pile of the carpet. Belliver's mouth and eyes opened wide. He looked at the Lazarite and then at Hurst. He leapt backward, away from the encumbrance at his ankles, making the first hoarse effort at a shout for help. Hurst did not give him time to finish it. The first row of seats caught Belliver and threw him, and Hurst swung the cylinder again. Belliver collapsed. "Was I in time?" Hurst asked of the woman in his mind. He thought she was crying when she answered, "Yes." He smiled. He stepped over the Lazarite and went to the control plate and began to work with it until he had Shearing safely on the floor of the stage. Then he cut the power and ran down another flight of steps to the bottom level. His mind was able to range free now. He could not sense anyone close at hand. Belliver seemed to have sent underlings elsewhere in the happy dream while he worked on Shearing. It was nothing for which a man would seek witnesses. Hurst vaulted the rail onto the stage and dragged Shearing away from the magnet. He felt uncomfortable in all that glare of light. He hauled and grunted until he got Shearing over the rail into the dark. Then he wrestled the harness off him. Shearing sobbed feebly and retched. "Can you stand up?" said Hurst. "Hey, Shearing!" He shook him hard. "Stand up!" He got Shearing up, a 190-pound rag doll draped over his shoulders. He began to walk him out of the theater. "Are you still there?" he asked of the woman. The answer came into his mind swiftly. "Yes, I'll help you watch. Do you see where the skiff is?" It was in a pod under the belly of the Happy Dream. "I see it," said Hurst. "Take that. Belliver's yacht is faster, but you need the crew. The skiff you can handle yourself." He walked Shearing into a fore and aft corridor. Shearing's feet were beginning to move of their own accord, and he had stopped retching. But his eyes were still blank, and he staggered aimlessly. Hurst's nerves were prickling with a mixture of fierce satisfaction and fear. Far above in the lush suite he felt Vernon stir and come to. There were men somewhere closer, quite close. He forced his mind to see. 2 of the very accurate men who had been with Vernon were playing cards with 2 others who were apparently stewards. The third one lolled in a chair, smoking. All 5 were in a lounge, just around the corner of a transverse corridor. The door was open. Without realizing that he had done so, Hurst took control of Shearing's mind. "Steady now. We're going past that corner without a sound. You hear me, Shearing? Not a sound." Shearing's eyes flickered vaguely. He frowned, and his step became steadier. The floor of the corridor was covered in a tough, resilient plastic that deadened footsteps. They passed the corner. The men continued to play cards. Hurst sent up a derisive insult to Vernon, and told Shearing to hurry a little. The stair leading down into the pod was just ahead, 10 yards, 5. A man appeared in the corridor ahead, coming from some storeroom with a rack of plastic bottles in his hand. "You'll have to run now," came the woman's thought, coolly. "Don't panic. You can still make it." The man with the bottles yelled. He began to run toward Hurst and Shearing, dropping the rack to leave his hands free. In the lounge room behind them, the card party broke up. Hurst took Shearing by the arm and clamped down even tighter on his mind, giving him a single command. They ran together, fast. The men from the lounge poured out into the main corridor. Their voices were confused and very loud. Ahead, the man who had been bringing the bottles was now between Hurst and the stair. He was a brown, hard man who looked like a pilot. He said, "You better stop," and then he grappled with Hurst and Shearing. The 3 of them spun around in a clumsy dance, Shearing moving like an automaton, Hurst and the pilot flailing away with their fists, and then the pilot fell back hard on the seat of his pants, with the blood bursting out of his nose and his eyes glazing. Hurst raced for the stair, propelling Shearing. They tumbled down it with a shot from a bee-gun buzzing over their heads. It was a short stair, with a double-hatch door at the bottom. They fell through it, and Hurst slammed it shut, almost on the toes of a man coming down the stair behind them. The automatic lock took hold. Hurst told Shearing, "You can stop now." A few minutes later, from the great swag belly of the Happy Dream, a small space skiff shot away and was quickly lost in the starshot immensity above the belt. End of Chapter 3.